Welcome to a study of the Gospel of Matthew, Part 2, Lesson number 21, which consists of the 27th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. The pericopes are Judas hangs himself, Jesus before Pilate, the soldiers mock Jesus, the crucifixion, the death of Jesus, the burial of Jesus, and the guard at the tomb. This is the crucial part of the Gospel of Matthew. He's been leading up to this, where the Messianic King surrenders himself in accord with the plan of his Father who sent him. There's nothing accidental about this. There's nothing of human will about this. As Jesus himself told Pilate, "You can't take my life from me," which is one of the paradoxical statements in all of literature. Imagine telling the person who holds the power thinks they hold the power of life and death over you, "You can't touch me." But it was true. Jesus did this voluntarily. That is what makes the gospel the gospel. It was not something that happened according to the forces of history. It was something that was in accord with the creative power of God. Something that actually, paradoxically, can be said to have occurred before the creation of the universe. God knew that if He created the universe with a creature that was in His likeness, that it would require the pain of sin and death to be absorbed into the divine being. His great love is demonstrated by the fact He went ahead and created us in His image. Judas hangs himself. Matthew 27, the first 10 verses. Early on Friday morning, the Sanhedrin convicted Jesus of a capital crime. Now, they could convict him of it, but they could not execute him. Rome did not allow local political authorities the right of capital punishment. They could only refer a capital crime criminal to Pilate, the governor, for execution. But they convicted him and remanded him to Pilate for execution. Whatever motivated Judas to betray Jesus, he was shocked by his death sentence. We speculated, along with some scholars, that maybe he was trying to force Jesus' hands. Really, his motivation is not all that important, because he betrayed Jesus for whatever reason, and it was not for the reason that the Father wanted it. And he tried to undo his actions. His despair is demonstrated by the fact he threw the 30 pieces of silver at the temple treasure. But the temple authorities refused to allow it to be used in the temple. Having secured the verdict that they desired, the Jewish leaders were not interested in Judas' change of mind and sent him away. In remorse, he hanged himself, and the Jewish leaders used the money to buy a clay pit. Now that's what a fuller's pit means. A place where they got sodium carbonate to bleach wool cloth. It wasn't, you couldn't grow anything on it, and since it was associated with death, they couldn't use it for anything else. So they made a place to bury strangers who died when they were in Jerusalem. Matthew cites Zechariah and Jeremiah to show that even this detail was part of the redemptive plan of God. Nothing accidental, nothing human motivated. It was all God's plan. We do not go to heaven. Heaven comes to us. It pleases the arrogance of human beings to talk about seeking God. I have a set of books written by a British author, 3 volumes, almost 1,000 pages each. It's the story of a troubled young man in pre-World War II England, searching for God, and he never realizes that God was searching for him. All he had to do was surrender, and God was there. Then Jesus before Pilate, Matthew 27, 11 through 26. While the events of the previous pericope were occurring, Jesus was being interrogated by Pilate. Now, this was in a place called the Pavement. I always visualized it as a huge open area. The last time that Mina and I went to Israel in 1990, they had by this time excavated the pavement, and it's about 20 feet square, about 400 square feet of area. What it was, that was where Pilate met with Jesus, and the Jewish leaders and the mob were out in the narrow streets around it. And so there was communication, but it wasn't this huge area that I always visualized. Pilate wasted no time with the crucial question, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Jesus answered just as directly, "Yes, it is as you say." As a conciliatory goodwill gesture, it was Pilate's custom to release a Jewish capital prisoner from Roman custody at Passover every year. Knowing that Jesus was a victim of the envy of the Jewish leaders, he offered to release either Jesus or a notorious murderer named Barabbas. And the crowd, coached by the Jewish leaders, chose Barabbas. During these events, Pilate's wife sent a message to her husband saying, "Don't have anything to do with condemning this innocent man." Pilate tried one more time. He symbolically washed his hands because the Jewish leaders refused to relent. And then he turned him over to the Roman crucifixion detail to be flogged and crucified. Pericope 3. The soldiers mocked Jesus. Matthew 27:27 through 31. The soldiers stripped off his outer robe and dressed him in imperial scarlet. Now, this was not any kind of recognition, even though Pilate realized and Jesus owned up to being the king of the Jews. These rough soldiers, they were using this to mock him. And they used the royal phrase, "Hail King." This is Ave Caesar in Latin. Hail Caesar. They did it to humiliate him. One of the things that we have tended to do as believers is overemphasize the physical suffering of the crucifixion and downplay the humiliation. Crucifixion was intended to humiliate the person killed. Enough said about that when you realize that people were crucified naked, hanging on the cross in the public eye. They improvised an imperial crown from thorny vines. Now, this was not for pain. It was just what was available to be like the crown, the diadem, the crown of power. The idea was they were humiliating him and flogging him. It was not unheard of that people who were crucified did not survive the flogging because it was done with a 9-tailed whip with many times sharp pieces of metal shell on it, and it would tear the flesh horribly. They also improvised a royal staff from available materials, and they mocked him with the royal greeting, "Hail, King of the Jews." As they did all these things to him, they continuously beat him with a staff and spat on him. When they had sufficiently humiliated him and inflicted near fatal physical punishment, they dressed him in his own robe and led him outside the north city walls to a place called Golgotha, the skull. 19th century Protestant belief to the contrary, it was not the so-called Gordon's tomb. It was where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is now located. When Mine and I went to Israel the first time in 1978, due to a mix-up and the cancellation of an El Al flight, we got to Jerusalem 3 days early, and before our guide was supposed to take over. And we went all over the city on our own using public transportation. When we did get our guide, his name was Menachem Rosenthal. He was a Bulgarian Jew who had gone to Israel before World War II and was trained in guerrilla warfare by the British Army. And he took us to places that you didn't usually go. And one of them was in the basement of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And on the wall was a graffiti in full color. And under it in Greek it said, "Here is the ship that brought us to this holy place." There can be no doubt that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located where the tomb of Jesus, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, was located. It was where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is now located. And then the crucifixion. Matthew 27:32 through 44. As the soldiers were leading Jesus to the place of execution, they encountered a man from Cyrene named Simon and forced him to carry the crossbeam of Jesus' cross. Contrary to almost all representations of the crucifixion, the crossbeam was placed on top of the central support and not a ways down on it. Thus he was crucified on a T-shaped or tau cross. The nails that held him to the cross were driven into the lower ends of his forearms, and his arms were also tied in place by ropes to keep from tearing the muscles. A sloping block of wood was nailed under his feet, which were crossed, and a nail driven through the crossed ankles. Now this is not just deduction. We have an actual feet excavated in Jerusalem of nails driven through the ankle and the block of wood beneath the feet. So when I said we tended to overemphasize the physical suffering, I don't want to make that too strong, because it was physically painful and debilitating. 2 men guilty of capital offenses were crucified at the same time. Jesus' cross was between those of the 2 criminals. All the while, they and all of those who passed by on the road mocked Jesus, and then that for which Jesus had been born, his death. Matthew 27:45 through 56. A great darkness covered the area from noon until about 3 p.m. Jesus, speaking in Aramaic, cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That was not just a cry quotation from the Old Testament. That was actually true, because part of the work of Jesus was to take the full force of sin and death into his own physical body. And he did. When I sometimes find it difficult to live and to make good choices, I always remember that cry. Remember the courage, the faithfulness, the loving sacrifice. My friends, that is the gospel. If you can get people to contemplate that, then you have done your job in spreading the gospel of Christ. I have a young man who comes to give me a shower twice a week, and I'm working on him. He's not a believer. He's not an atheist. And it's beginning to affect him and to change the way he sees his life and the world. That Jesus alone died for him. If you need encouragement, think about that. After refusing a pain-reducing medication, he cried out again and surrendered to death. As he died, the curtain separating the sections of the temple from one another was split from top to bottom, which symbolized that all of God's new covenant people now had access to his holy presence. Many of the tombs were opened, and those buried in them temporarily walked the streets of the holy city. These events caused the captain of the crucifixion squad to realize that Jesus was some sort of divine being. The translation that surely this was the Son of God is too strong. It didn't mean he became a believer. It means he recognized that Jesus was uniquely holy. I would like to speculate that that was the starting of his own redemption. I don't know. I can dream. Many Galilean women, among whom were the three Marys, were observing from a distance. Next pericope, the burial of Jesus, Matthew 27, 57 through 61. Before sundown, Joseph, a member of the Sanhedrin from the city of Arimathea, went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate granted his request, and Joseph wrapped the body in clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new, unused tomb. He then closed the tomb with a large rolling stone. The three Marys observed this event from a distance. And finally, the guard at the tomb, Matthew 27, 62 through 66. The next day, which was the day on which the meal was cooked, which would be eaten on the Sabbath. And on this occasion, the meal which would be eaten on the Passover Sabbath, the Jewish leaders went to Pilate and requested that a guard be set over the entrance to the tomb to keep Jesus' followers from stealing the body. Pilate refused to use Roman soldiers, but allowed them to place a seal on the stone and use their own temple guards. In the beginning centuries of the first millennium, this became the Jewish explanation for the empty tomb. But it was not the truth. It was a made-up story, because Jesus was raised from the dead by the power of the Father, and he reigns throughout this age and into the age to come. Thank you.